In this lesson, we're going to look at the versioning of UDT data. So we've already looked at adding a unversioned or untyped block into our project library over here. And now what we're going to do is look at what happens when we need to update an object. Now this is important because through your development of your system, and if you're going to use an asset-orientated approach, you will have to do some updates at some point in the future. Understanding how that impacts your system is important. So we're going to go ahead and open our analog scale block. Now I appreciate we haven't been through any of these blocks yet, and that's not important for this lesson. We will come on to what this is and what we're doing with it later, but I'm using this as an example of upgrading an object. So across the top here we have a banner that says the editor is write protected because it's connected to a type in the library. And that's because this analog scale block here appears in our library analog scale here. So in order for us to make modifications, it won't let me type anything at the moment. It won't let me do anything to modify this block in any way. I can't change any options or do anything. In order for us to actually make modifications, we need to edit the type. And once we click that, we then go into a test state. And you'll notice that the project library now has two versions. It has our version 2, which is in test, and it has our version 1 or 0.0.1 that is our default version or our current version that is being used in our project. Now from here, we are able to make changes. You can see that I can now type and make changes to the block. But most importantly, we can also download this to test. So just be aware that downloading it on a live system would actually put it in the project, similar to if it wasn't a library object. You will execute the in-test code. For anybody who's used Rockwell and the in-test state, it's a very similar concept that you can put something in test, and then if it doesn't work the way you want it to, you can discard all changes that you've made, re-download, and it will go back to the way it was before. Just bear in mind a few things, and for anybody who's taken the library management course, that if you go ahead and click the discard changes and delete version, it will do it immediately. It doesn't ask, are you sure? So if you've written a load of stuff in here and you accidentally click that button, you've lost everything that you've done. And there's no undo, there's no going back. So make sure you save your project before you start doing this stuff, just in case you slip and you hit the button. So once we're in this state, we can go ahead and make changes, and we can release the version, or as I said, discard the version and release go back to the previous version. But something that they've improved in TIA Portal 17 over previous versions is that you can now check whether there are things dependent on the object that you're changing. So if you remember back to our previous lesson where we looked at adding the analog asset manager into the library view, into the library types, you'll remember that when we drag the analog asset manager across, it also included the support blocks here. So the alarm manager, limit condition, and the analog scale. So if I'm now editing the analog scale, it should be that if I make changes to this object, that the analog asset manager also needs to change, because now we've got a new version of something it is dependent upon. So if I go ahead and click check whether dependencies need to be adapted, right now it's saying no change of dependent types, because although we've got a new version, TIA Portal is looking at the differences between version 1 and version 2, and it's coming up that they're both exactly the same right now. If I was to go ahead and add a new input value, for example, saying raw value 2, and then I go ahead and click check, it now says dependent instances need to be adapted. Dependent instances need to be adapted. Do you want these instances to be set to the in test state? So if I go ahead and click OK, what we'll see now is, if I expand this, that the analog asset manager also has a version 2 now. And that's because what it's doing is it's linking version 2 to this version 2 here and saying this version 2 is dependent upon this version 2. Whereas it does work in some cases that you are making changes, but things don't get updated. So if we look at the analog limit condition, for example, version 2 is still dependent upon the analog limit condition, but it's dependent upon version 1 of that. And that's because we haven't modified it. So don't expect everything that your block is dependent upon to also be upgraded, because that's not how it works. You will over time start seeing that you've got version 2, 3, 4, 5, basically all of the high level objects that are dependent on lots of things, they get reversioned lots of times when you change components at the bottom or objects at the bottom. But the objects that are actually at the bottom that make up that main object, they don't get updated all that often, because it's not until you actually need to make a change in those objects that the parent objects need to get updated. So with that being said, if I was to now release this version, we get a window that says define the properties for the release type version. You should really keep the name the same. I don't see any reason why you would want to change the name. That's just going to make things confusing. I'm not entirely sure if you can, but I wouldn't. What I would do is make some comments in here saying updated analog scale to include a new input. And then you have the option here to say delete unused type versions without the default identifier from the library. Now, if I was to check that and click OK, it would delete version 1 from both here and here. And that's because we're not using them in our project anymore. But because they only exist in our project, they're in a project library, not a global library, they will be lost, and you can't go back and get them unless you reload your project, because you wouldn't have saved it yet. So just bear that in mind. It's worth holding on to them if you are unsure if what you're doing needs to run for a period of time before you're happy with it. I mean, you should leave it in test state, but there will be times in the future where you think everything's okay, you version it, you leave it and say everything's happy, and then you actually need to roll back because of something you've missed or a different change that needs to happen or needs to be reworked. So I'm not a huge fan of deleting things straight away, but the option is there. So if I click OK, what we'll see now is that the analog asset manager did not release. And this is something that you need to be careful of. Going in and clicking whilst in this window to release will only release this one object. Now, if I was to go ahead again and edit this type, sorry, I went a different way to last time. If you do it from here, it'll ask you for a test environment in which that you are editing this this object. If you don't have it in your project, it won't let you put it into test because it needs to have an instance in your project for it to work. So if I click OK, and I now remove that raw value 2 and say check whether the dependent types need to be adapted. So there's nothing that needs to be changed, and that's because version 2 is already in a test state. So if I was now to go ahead and release the analog asset manager, so if I open this one and I was to release this one, because when you release a top level object, you must release dependencies. So update block call. I need to update this because it's got a new raw input, a new interface input, or it did have. Remember how tier portal works with checksums and doing its comparisons and stuff. I know nothing's actually changed, but it knows that the object has changed in the past and it needs to do an update. So now everything's okay. If I were to release this version, we get a slightly different window which says release dependent types to the new default version. So there are dependent types that will also be released. Now remember, last time we did this, we didn't get this option, and we didn't get the option because the analog scale block is not dependent upon anything. It has things that are dependent upon it, but it's not dependent upon anything. So if I go ahead and release this one now, when we go back to the libraries, you can see that what's happened now, I left that button ticked to say delete dependencies, delete previous default version, so I've lost version 1. But now what we end up with is a version 2 analog asset manager that has a lower version than the analog scale, which is fine. It is fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not a true case of what's happened. Like, what's actually happened is we made a change to version 2 and we released that change, but we forgot to release this one. So there are better ways of doing this. If I was to, again, go and edit the type for the analog scale, and I'll just make a small change. In fact, I don't know if it'll pick up comments. No, it doesn't pick up comments. So if I was to change that to false, for example, and go ahead and say check whether the dependent types need to be adapted, it should be. Oh, sorry, it won't pick up that stuff because they're not. The actual parent object doesn't need to change because there's no interface change. There's nothing that means that that block has to change. So let me go ahead and change the name of this interface, for example. So dependent types need to be adapted. We now have a version 3 of this analog asset manager. Now, if we have a look at the library view, or if we click this button here on the analog asset manager, what this will do is open the flyout panel for the library management system. We have a lesson on this. It's optional, but I recommend that you go and have a look at it because this makes a lot more sense when you start looking at this stuff. What happens now is what we can do is we can click on the types folder and we can say update, sorry, not update types. We can say release all. You'll do a compile. As long as everything compiles, what will happen now is we should get the pop-up window. So multiple types will be released. We can set a comment for these saying updated the name of the input pin. I don't want to delete unused types. Click OK. And this time what it will do is it will update everything that needs to be updated because of the changes that we've made. And you can't leave anything out by doing it that way. You do need to be careful. I wouldn't recommend that you start jumping in and making loads of changes at once to lots of different blocks. You need to be methodical in what you're doing. You need to have a clear process of what you're changing. You can and you will get confused in your library if you start making lots of changes to lots of different blocks at once. There's nothing wrong with, if I needed to change analog scale and the analog limit condition, absolutely nothing wrong with changing your analog scale, testing that, releasing that, and then going and changing your analog limit condition, testing that and releasing that, and ending up with 2 additional versions through your analog asset manager. And then when you're happy, deleting previous versions. Your versions do not need to be linear in their numbering. If we went from version 002 to version 008, that just shows that we went through an iteration process of development, and the versions between those don't matter. That's something that is worth playing with and getting used to and familiar with. As we go through the course, we'll see more and more of these changes. There will be times that I need to make changes during an actual sort of development lesson, and you'll see more of this process as we do that.